Hi, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well this evening. Um, this is the fourth session of the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, and I'm coming to you from Jojage, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. And today I'm going to be bringing up a number of different issues that have been in the news developments around Canadian foreign policy. I thought I would begin with Latin America because there's the Summit of the Americas taking place in the coming days down in LA. There's been a fair bit of discussion of that recently. And also today, Prime Minister Trudeau is meeting with the Chilean President, Gabriel Boric, in Ottawa. And that's, I think, kind of interesting that that meeting's taking place. A couple of days ago, some people may have seen that Trudeau, that Joly, Foreign Minister Joly, met with Juan Guaido's foreign minister, which is quite remarkable in my opinion. I thought they had kind of given up on the whole Juan Guaido charade, but here we are, three and a half years after Guaido declared himself president of Venezuela in a park. The Trudeau government is continuing to recognize Guaido. Most countries in the hemisphere have given up on the whole Guaido project, but clearly the Trudeau government hasn't. And just to go backwards into the extent to which the Trudeau government got behind the Guaido effort. Globe Mail, Canadian Press, Associated Press all reported that Canadian officials played an important role in bringing the Venezuelan opposition together to back Guaido's self-declaration as president, and that they spent months working on that before it took place. They had the whole Lima group. The Trudeau government was the main player in the Lima group going back to 2017 that brought together the governments opposing the Maduro government and that rallied behind Guaido. Canada funded opposition in Venezuela, brought the Venezuelan government to the International Criminal Court, brought in sanctions against Venezuela. So right at the heart of this strategy, which has been a clear failure, and that failure, which has started to get some, finally, quite frankly, some corporate media attention to it. So, in Friday's Globe and Mail, John Kirk, a Latin American studies professor, I believe from Dalhousie or one of the Halifax universities, he had an op-ed in the Globe titled Canada's flawed Latin American policy demands a reset and distance from the US, where Kirk, in fairly mild kind of language, but went over the failure of the Venezuela effort to overthrow the Venezuelan government, the reversal of the coup in Bolivia, also Canada's role in ousting Manuel Zelaya in Honduras back in 2009, and then backing the very corrupt and undemocratic regimes that followed from that, which was recently defeated at the ballot box by in fact Manuel Zelaya's wife, who's now the president of Honduras. So Trudeau's Latin American strategy has really collapsed. A bunch of new, more socialistic Latin American integrationist politicians have won, and the candidates that were the sort of more pro-Washington, pro-corporate that Trudeau was backing have tended to lose at the ballot box. And that includes the Colombian election last week, where Gustavo Petro won in the first round. We'll see if he can win in the second round. Some interesting sort of dynamics there. But then also later in the year, Lula looks set to win in Brazil, and if Petro wins in Colombia and then Lula wins, which are both, well, Lula at least is expected. It's not clear now in Colombia, but that would mean that 7 of the biggest countries in the hemisphere have social democratic, left kind of oriented presidents. And that is decidedly not what the Trudeau government has tried to work to achieve in recent years, be it with a very overt effort to overthrow the Venezuelan government, also its role in the Bolivia coup, but also more generally with its diplomatic comments, with its trade negotiations, etc. And the Summit of the Americas, you're seeing some of that refusal by the Latin American countries to just go along with Washington's aggressive policies in the hemisphere, where AMLO, the president in Mexico, said he wasn't going to attend the Summit of the Americas if Venezuelan president, the Cuban president, Nicaraguan president weren't invited. And that's actually put the whole summit into quite a problematic state. So you see that the more socialistic Latin American integrationist politicians are exerting themselves increasingly in the hemisphere as quite frankly, a remarkable reversal from the Trudeau government's Lima group, from this sort of very subservient pro-Washington policies that Trudeau has really been pushing in the hemisphere. Shifting gears to the other side of the world, some people probably saw that Global News, and initially Mercedes Stephenson, the global reporter, and then it got wide attention, reported on the fact that Chinese fighter planes had buzzed the Canadian Aurora aircraft, patrol aircraft, off of Korea, off of North Korea. And according to the Stevenson's article, which then got picked up elsewhere, the Chinese fighter pilots, the Canadian military is claiming that dozens of times that the Canadian patrol aircraft had been buzzed by the Chinese aircraft, and said that they actually gave them the middle finger, that the Chinese fighter pilots gave the Canadians the middle finger, which I looked this up, and apparently the middle finger is not a Chinese cultural practice. It is, of course, possible that some Chinese watched a North American or Hollywood movie and saw that practice and learned from that. That is obviously possible, but it is not, according to the Google, a Chinese cultural practice. And this article really read as a Canadian military PR story. They fed this to the Global Reporter as a way to engender tension between Canada and China. And the next day, reporters asked Trudeau, asked Melanie Joly in separate press conferences, what their opinion was of this, and both of them had to, of course, condemn China for their supposedly aggressive policies vis-a-vis Canadian military off the coast of Korea. Now, it's of course important to note this is about 8,000 kilometers, I believe, from Canadian landmass. We're talking about something that is, of course, much closer to China than it is to Canada. The Canadian government and the Canadian military presented it as Canada just trying to enforce UN sanctions on North Korea, which of course do exist, but it's not a UN mission that the Canadian patrol aircraft is part of, which of course is alongside American, Japanese, and a few other countries patrolling. This is something they have appointed to themselves the fulfillment of the UN sanctions on North Korea. But basically, how I see it, or the probable, and I can't prove this, but the probable scenario here is that the Canadian military has been pushing greater Canadian military involvement in the South China Sea, near North Korea, as part of the Obama administration's pivot towards Asia, which goes back, more than a decade now. And back in 2011, maybe it was 2012, Jonathan Vance, who's the head of the Chief of the Defense Staff, Canadian military, said, if one wants to have any respect or gravitas, you have to be in that region. Talking about South China Sea, actually at the time talking about setting up a Canadian naval base in Singapore. So basically, what I see how this is playing out is the Canadian military has been pressing the Canadian government to allow for more military deployments in the region, and then Chinese respond to what they see as aggressive Canadian American posturing in the region with their own buzzing or other form of sort of low scale pushback. And then the Canadian military brings this to a sympathetic corporate journalist who reports on it, and then that presses the prime minister, the foreign minister, to comment and to criticize China, which allows for further kind of escalatory processes in the region, where allow for potentially more Canadian deployments in the region. And you have to China is an increasingly powerful country, of course, and now it's spending up to a quarter $250 billion on its military, huge increase in military spending in recent years and stuff. But the reality is there's about 30,000 Canadian troops in South Korea, or American troops in South Korea. There's tens of thousands of American troops in Japan, major military bases. There's Canadians that are part of the mission in South Korea, and if there's some in Japan, the Aurora patrol aircraft's part of that in Japan. But there's major American military operations, submarines, nuclear power, capable, very powerful nuclear submarines, all across the region that are really trying to contain China. So I think that this story sort of just contributes to this escalatory kind of process. Now, another development in the region and in Canada is kind of interesting one, which is the Biden administration about 2 weeks ago announced its Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. And basically, they're trying to bring together countries in the hemisphere, in the region in Asia, or it was so-called Indo-Pacific, that are part of trying to contain China. And basically, so far, most of the American strategy has been more around a sort of military strategy, but they need an economic part, because Americans, of course, are not part of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that the Trump administration withdrew from, which was actually initially an American initiative to try to bring together economies, breaking them away from China. And now the Americans aren't even part of that due to Trump and protectionist policies. Some, quite frankly, some of it for the better. But basically, the Americans are trying to set up another sort of economic vehicle to bring countries in the region towards Washington and away from China. Now, Canada is not part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. And a number of sort of mainstream establishment right-wing voices are framing this as, Canada's being excluded, and it's tied to Canada not going along with their policy on China, and it fits in with the Canada not being part of the AUKUS, the Britain, Australia, US nuclear submarine accord, Canada not being part of the Quad, and so the right-wing voices have been really kind of hammering the Trudeau government for it not being kind of more aligned with Washington on China. But Thomas Walcom, in I think a very sensible piece in the Toronto Star, he's a columnist at the Toronto Star, actually points out that Canada being left out of this new American initiative is really an opportunity to not just continue along with this Washington policy of ramping up tensions with China, and just because this is what Washington is doing, therefore we will follow that trajectory. In a different part of the world, Ukraine, there's been some developments on that front that I think are worth mentioning. First of all, David Puglisi, the very good Ottawa Citizen military reporter, reported that the Canadian government's trying to secure 100,000 artillery shells to send to the Ukrainians, which is a huge amount. The official price would be something like $500 million. So that would suck up the whole $500 million they announced for weapons to the Ukraine in the recent budget. They've, of course, about 2 weeks ago now, I guess, they already sent 20,000 artillery shells that are in the Canadian stock, which is worth about $100 million. So this would be a huge increase of Canadian weapons into the Ukrainian military, and would provide it the capacity to fight the Russian military even longer, and what quite frankly looks like a war that's now very likely going to be going on for probably years. So that's a sort of a further kind of like escalatory dynamic. And alongside that, of course, as I've mentioned a couple of times, the Canadian government continues to have a no negotiation, no diplomacy kind of position. One thing I wanted to point out on this, and I'm just about to publish an article on this question, is the Canadian government's role in hyping up rape and sexual violence against women and children in Ukraine, and there's been some interesting sort of developments on that, where the Ukrainian Parliament's Commissioner for Human Rights was recently turfed by the Ukrainian Parliament after Ukrainian media outlets and journalists complained that she was just starting to exaggerate and basically fabricate allegations of rape and sexual violence by Russian troops. And it got, some of the allegations are just completely wild of them raping, I think it's like a 9-month-old boy with a spoon, and all kinds of things that just became really outlandish kind of claims that the Ukrainian media that investigated these found there was no corroboration. A number of these allegations were just reported on in the Canadian or Western media without any sort of critical comment. And the Canadian government announced a week ago or so $1 million to the International Criminal Court to investigate allegations of sexual violence by Russian soldiers in Ukraine. They devoted 10 RCMP officers. And previously, they'd actually announced about $7 million in funding for similar type projects. And of course, what this is designed to do, and I don't at all, I'm certain, if you know anything about the history of warfare, it's very, very unlikely that Russian troops have not raped Ukrainian women. That is, the history of warfare is very brutal in terms of sexual assault and rape by foreign militaries. So that is, almost certainly has transpired. But what the Canadian government funding for these initiatives is designed to do is to amplify allegations, and as some of the allegations have been shown to be just basically kind of wild allegations, and designed to sort of build up the sort of anti-Russia kind of policies. And in this piece that I'm going to publish, what I do is I relate it to what happened in Libya. And the Harper government did exactly the same thing. There was all these allegations that Gaddafi in 2011, where Canada led the NATO bombing of Libya, that Gaddafi's forces had raped, large-scale rape in the east of the country. You even had these allegations, which Susan Rice, the U.S. ambassador at the UN, claimed that they were giving Viagra out to the troops to go and rape. And there was a real racist kind of element, because it was often associated with sub-Saharan African mercenaries that were supposedly fighting for Gaddafi, who were supposedly the perpetrators of this rape. Now, both Amnesty, Human Rights Watch looked into this question and found they couldn't find any evidence of this mass rape that had taken place in Libya. But the Canadian government had repeatedly hyped the question and had devoted millions of dollars in aid funding to different projects to investigate the matter, to provide help to survivors, etc. So this is part of the kind of propaganda war taking place, and it's certainly something that Canada is contributing to. Now, on the question of Ukraine, shifting to a discussion of the NDP, yesterday, Heather McPherson, NDP's foreign affairs critic, put out a tweet that is just pretty wild. And she said, quote, "Vladimir Putin is using the starvation of millions of people around the world as a bargaining chip in his illegal war and genocide against Ukraine. This is not someone we should be negotiating with or worrying about humiliating," in quotations. That was a direct reference to French President Emmanuel Macron, who referred to not humiliating Russia as part of a way of getting out of endless war, of endless conflict in Europe. Okay, he used the word humiliating. So here you have the NDP foreign affairs critic who's saying we can't have any negotiations with Russia, and explicitly responding to the French president, who, whatever you want to say about the use of the word humiliating, and I think you could maybe choose a different word, but is trying to basically not further ratchet up tensions, further go down the path of endless warfare. And this is the defense critic or the foreign affairs critic of our social democratic party. And I should say, she's directly responding to Macron, but I think she's indirectly responding to Henry Kissinger, who's not somebody who's exactly shied away from militarism or war, who at the World Economic Forum suggested there was going to need to be some land concessions by Ukraine. Also, Joe Biden a couple of days ago also referred to negotiations. So here you have a situation where Heather McPherson is finding herself on the sort of more warlike and militarist end from Emmanuel Macron, Kissinger, arguably even Biden. And you got to ask yourself what's going on here, right? And I think there's many elements to understanding how pro-proxy war the NDP is. Canada had a long history of NATO, Canada's ties to Washington, military companies in this country benefiting from NATO expansion. But I think there's actually a dynamic that's specific to Edmonton, right? That's where Heather McPherson is MP. And if in 1976, the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies was set up at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. That was only the second Ukrainian studies studies program in the world. And this is, of course, at a time when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. Obviously, Ukrainian nationalism was shunned within the USSR, and you can discuss that one way or another. But basically, what the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at U of A was about was this really hard line, nationalistic, anti-Soviet kind of ideological formation. And if you look at actually the creation of it, that's the people who were behind it were very much of a quite frankly, the people that are, like the grandfather of, who was also from Edmonton, Chrystia Freeland, her grandfather, which have a real sort of neo-Nazi Ukrainian nationalist kind of background. So McPherson is not only, the head of this NDP that's part of this broader political culture in this country that's incredibly pro-NATO, pro-Washington, but also specifically in her riding, there's a constituency and there's political forces that are pushing her in a very aggressive kind of way on this question. And that gets me to maybe a slightly more uplifting development within the NDP. I also wrote a story about the NDP's policy on Palestine and how much it's improved in the past 14 months or so. And it's actually Heather McPherson is the one, and partly or heavily responsible for that. And just a couple of days ago, I think on Monday or Tuesday, she of last week, she tweeted out, she sent a letter to Melanie Joly and then tweeted out that the NDP will, quote, the NDP will fight for the protection of human rights of Palestinians. Canada must demand an independent investigation into the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, denounce Israel's plan to forcibly expel people from Masafar Yatta, respond to Amnesty International's findings of apartheid. So the NDP has really had an incredible shift on the Palestinian question over the past year, since before the convention. I just wrote a story about that, detailing some of that. And I think we need to applaud the NDP for that improvement on the Palestine question. There's no doubt about that. That is a positive development. But I do think, and I kind of mentioned this in previous Canadian foreign policy hours, and about some of the context and understanding that part of it is the activism happening within the party and the push for the Palestine resolution at the last convention. But I think it's also partly due to the fact that McPherson is so militaristic on the Ukraine question and on many other questions, has very much aligned with the government. And in response to my piece on the NDP improving its Palestine policy, Nino Pugliese pointed out, and I think correctly, that he would like to believe the NDP has changed track due to listening to those advocating for Palestine, which I think is part of it. But then he says, quote, however, more realistically, I believe that the NDP is tactically using the Palestinian cause as the only foreign policy that sets them apart from the liberals and the conservatives. That's a bit of an exaggeration on the only, but I think there is something to be said for that question of they've now see Palestine as a way of differentiating themselves from the liberals, and also as a way to placating some of the base of the party that maybe is not so happy with their Ukraine policy, maybe not so happy with their support for increased military spending, et cetera, et cetera. On Friday, I had the good fortune to participate in the International League of People's Struggles Conference in Ottawa, which was quite an impressive gathering. I mean, this is an explicitly anti-imperialist network, global network. It was a couple hundred people at this community center in Ottawa, and it was kind of amazing. The Israel lobby attacked the conference really aggressively, and they announced that they had actually tried to get the city of Ottawa to block the ILPS from booking a community center because the ILPS supports armed struggle. In part, I think because the ILPS, its roots or where it's strong is in the Philippines, where there is actually armed struggle movements taking place. And they really went at the conference because also Khalid Barakat also participated, spoke, who they're trying to claim is tied to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, an organization that's deemed a terrorist organization in this country. So the Israel lobby really came out hard against this conference, but really what this conference was a couple hundred, mostly young, mostly racialized activists coming together and talking about anti-imperialism. And it was quite an impressive display. To be honest with you, I expected something much smaller and less well organized. I was quite impressed by the get-together, and the get-together was timed for right after the CANSEC arms fair that was taking place in Ottawa, sort of part of a counter CANSEC arms fair, and there was a number of mobilizations against the CANSEC arms fair, the biggest arms conference in North America. And on the morning of June 1st, at 7 a.m., people rallied and were actually able to really block the traffic into the arms fair and postponed Canada's Defense Minister Anita Anand's speech at the arms fair, where she was, of course, going to promote more arms sales and do the bidding of the arms companies alongside a couple other Canadian ministers. So there was, I think, a very important mobilization, anti-war mobilization last week in Ottawa, and then an anti-imperialist conference that partly flowed out of that is a good sign that there's some anti-war mobilization activism taking place. And that's what I have to say, and I'll open it up to people's comments, questions. And I see that Nahid has her hand raised, and go ahead, and floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'm still at work, but thanks for all these updates. The sessions are becoming really very informative for us. Going back to the Ukraine, I put in the chat just recently, I listened to Richard Black, is an American Republican senator. And to me, this is like a must listen to. And so I did send it around to some friends and people I know. And I can say it's unfortunate that some people, when they hear the statement that Putin had no other choice than attack, they stop watching the rest. It's just amazing that how people keep themselves closed-minded. Even when American saying what they have been doing in order to lure or create conditions that over time, Russia, it was not a winnable situation. And I remember, Yves, even you mentioned you felt they must have had other choices, but I think there is a lot we don't know. If you have not listened to this, it's unfortunate 1 hour, but it's worthwhile every minute of it. And in relation to Aleppo, really in Syria, you really realize that how American had absolutely no problem whatsoever with the ISIS or extremist group killing people and raping women, impregnating, and that was a policy, direct policy. And now here in Ukraine, So we hear all these allegations about rape. And then this Richard Black was saying actually what we don't hear, what the Ukrainian soldiers, military is doing to this Russian soldiers, like they're castrating them, and they are shooting at them with hands tied in their back. You know, so giving really real examples of war crime for POW. And we don't hear about it whatsoever. We obviously, major media, we just see and hear from one side. And I agree with you that war, there's lots of atrocities happen, but it's very unfortunate that we don't hear the extent and also factual aspects of that at all. And I really worry that with groups like this that are very self-motivated to educate themselves, and after a while could become like another bubble that we know, but those who should know, which is the public, or the decision makers may not. And we have to find a way out of this, find a way to address how to disseminate information. Just to finish it off, for example, you talked about this John Kirk article, and I think this, what he wrote in Globe and Mail about the flawed Canadian policy in Latin America, that needs a follow-up letter to the editor or something by our groups, by our members. You know, we have to pick up this ball and just keep bouncing it and creating a momentum. The more that kind of discussion and conversation happens. So what I'm asking is somehow create some sort of action item at the end of your presentation or session.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just on the Latin America front, you know, the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute did do a event called "The Collapse of Trudeau's Latin America Policy." I believe that was the name of the title of the talk, and then just before that, on the 3-year anniversary of the Guaido self-declaration, there was a public letter that was circulated, was signed by a number of prominent people, criticizing Trudeau's policy on Venezuela and basically saying it collapsed, and you know, trying to raise it up. It didn't get, the corporate media didn't really bite on that public letter. I would like to believe that, and there was actually a webinar that was done that had quite wide circulation on Venezuela, Canada, Venezuela. I would like to believe that Kirk's op-ed is partly tied into that sort of campaigning that has been done. And there's actually a weekly monthly Venezuela online rally that people in Vancouver organize, that people could participate in. I actually just got the email for that. Maybe I'll look for that in today or yesterday. I got an email for the upcoming one. I believe it's on June 16th. So that's, you know, kind of thing of keeping the ball kind of rolling on the issue. I totally agree that when there are openings into the corporate media, it's good to take advantage of those and try to, you know, push it one step further wherever possible. Laura, go ahead. You're
Oh,
muted.
okay. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Just before I go to my question, just responding also to Nahid. I mean, I hear your call for actions, and I live in the US and I'm part of various peace groups like Code Pink and Peace Action. And they do have, now these are groups with staff and everything, but they have a very well-oiled machines where at the end of every call, there are petitions, letters going out. And also there is the Peace Action group. They do a lot of trying to write letters to the editor in local newspapers. But I mean, for a lot of these things, you do have to have staff and things. It's rather hard to organize. But yeah, I mean, I think that's what is needed. The question that I had is I was wondering if there are any chinks in the armor, like you're seeing a little bit in the US, like with regard to Ukraine, where the New York Times came out with an article, I think it was the whole editorial saying like, how long can this go on, this sort of unrestrained support for the military option in Ukraine. That's not quite how they put it. And New York, it'll always be more nuanced than that. But I'm just wondering if you're seeing that in newspapers in Canada or any other publications that aren't sort of just progressive publications, but mainstream publications. Are you seeing any kind of chinks in the armor of support for this non-negotiation military option we seem to be favoring in Ukraine?
It wasn't the whole editorial board. It was a member of the editorial board, and it was a very good op-ed in the New York Times. No, I don't think I have seen something equivalent in the Globe and Mail. I don't have access to the Toronto Star like I used to, but certainly I read the Globe and the National Post. I haven't seen anything in that like that there, or yeah. So I mean, again, you know, like you have Heather McPherson, the NDP foreign affairs critic, who's coming out, you know, repeatedly now saying no negotiations. That is reflective of the political culture and the opinion. But I don't believe I've seen in a piece I did a week ago or so about Canada calling for waging peace. I quoted Senator Wu, I'm forgetting his first name, Canadian senator, who in the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, he kind of prodded Mélanie Joly on, you know, what's going on the diplomatic front. Are we trying to support negotiations? And she kind of refused to answer. And then he kind of pushed it a bit more. And he finally said something to the effect of, what are we doing to wage peace? And then she kind of said, oh, I talked to people around the world. I talked to other officials around the world. Really a sort of a non-answer. I mean, so that's sort of the type of kind of breakthrough. I was hoping to try to organize some sort of bigger kind of webinar event, thinking maybe on February 24th, the 4-month anniversary of the Russian invasion, where maybe get someone like the senator to speak and to get some, maybe even ask somebody if there was any chance that Leah Gazan from the NDP might participate in an event that was sort of structured around, you know, negotiate now, diplomacy now, or something kind of in that direction. But I'm to be honest with you, I'm a little certainly after seeing Heather McPherson's tweet, which I just saw today, I'm doubtful that any NDP MP, even those who would agree with that position, which I'm sure there are a number of, like Leah Gazan and Nikki Ashton probably, but I'm kind of skeptical that they would, even if they agree with that, that they would, you know, participate in an event that, was framed in that way. So,
and I assume that would that be true even of a marginal party like the Greens? Like there's nobody there coming out saying negotiate.
I'm not seeing. I mean, Elizabeth May made that statement in the House of Commons. That's what 2 weeks maybe into the Russian invasion. It got a certain amount of attention. It was okay. It was a little bit better than what the other parties were saying. But I honestly, I haven't followed her Twitter account, so maybe I should take a look at that. But my impression, I'm not hearing any of it. Maybe I'm missing it, but I'm not hearing anyone. The interim leader of the Greens, I'm not hearing anything from them about Russia. so someone else may have better information on that front, but I'm not hearing that.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions, comments?
Can you just ask them to sign the anti-nuclear petition that closes tomorrow? I put the
Yep.
link in the chat.
People see it in terms of an action item. Sign the, I think it's sponsored by Alexandre Boulris, is that?
Yes, yes,
one?
that's
Yeah.
the one.
And parliamentary petitions, of course, if they get 500 people sign, they get read in the House of Commons, which is something the government ostensibly has to respond. Often they just take note of its existence and they don't necessarily respond like you would, genuinely respond. But nonetheless, it's a one way to put some pressure on the government on the issue. And I should say the Trudeau government has been, its position on nuclear weapons has been pretty shocking, right? They say they believe in the abolition of nuclear weapons, but they have done everything to subvert the meetings that organize the United Nations Treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. They didn't attend before the meetings that negotiated that treaty, and then they voted against a number of UN resolutions upholding the treaty, and of course they haven't signed it, and it has now become a law because it hit more than 50 countries about I guess a year and a half ago or so. So it is important. That issue really highlights the utter hypocrisy of Trudeau government rhetoric, right? They say they believe in nuclear abolition of nuclear weapons. They say they believe in the rules-based international order, and here you have an effort to strengthen the rules-based international order to stigmatize and criminalize nuclear weapons, and they have no interest in participating in that process, let alone signing. Any other questions, comments, criticisms?
I just had a follow-up. This is just a question about you personally. I was wondering, are you working totally alone, or do you have an organization? I'm sorry, I'm in the US and I should probably know this, but I don't.
Well, I'm part of the board of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, but I have mostly over the past 2 decades or so, I've been different activist groups like Haiti solidarity groups, Block the Empire, other groups, but I've mostly been a Mouvement Québécois pour la Paix. I've mostly just been a independent author and activist over the last I guess 2 decades now, and written books. I've written 10 books on Canadian foreign policy.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Sandhu.
All right, thanks, Steve. This is Bhagwan. I was just going to say, so that folks don't feel too disheartened with respect to Venezuela. I think one of the indicators that we can look at is that the government, number one, has sort of stopped talking about it. Okay, if you look back, say, a couple of years ago, it was all gung ho. They invited Juan Guaido, and so it's a kind of almost a silence. And that, if you have to read the tea leaves and whatnot, I mean, they're clearly taking direction from the U.S. But I have a feeling that with the changes in Chile, the president of Chile is now today is in Ottawa. I think we should remain hopeful that something will happen, because that gung-hoism that they used to have, especially when Chrystia Freeland, the Champagne and the foreign ministers, that has quieted down. And I don't know, what do you make of that with respect strictly to Venezuela? Even in Nicaragua, for instance, right? Like, it was a little bit of a bit of sort of noise, but then not like what we used to with respect, for example, when Bolivia, the coup d'etat happened in Bolivia, they were celebrating here, right? So now it's, so just your opinion. I mean, my feeling is that that's an indicator, a very, very early indicator of something, of thawing perhaps, or whatever, but I'd like to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I started off with that question. I think it's clear that their policy, in not just in Venezuela, most obvious in Venezuela, but in the hemisphere has collapsed. It's been a failure. They instigated an unprecedented open campaign to overthrow the government. 3.5 years later, it's clearly been unsuccessful, and they have downgraded. They don't talk about it very much anymore. I agree with you completely. If in the initial months, they were boasting about it. They were boasting about helping to opposition unite to get behind Guaido. They were boasting about, Chrystia Freeland did her video there on April 30th of 2019, where she basically was a rallying cry for Venezuelan military to oust the government, to oust the president. That's undoubtedly there have been positive developments in the hemisphere that have quite quickly reversed what was a pro-corporate, pro-Washington rise, and it is important. It's important to note that the left forces, the sort of socialistic Latin American integration forces, that sort of so-called pink tide that rose in the early 2000s through the 2000s, sort of turning around 2014, 2015, whatever. That was all done electorally. In case of the right resurgence, that there was a bunch of that was coup d'etats. I mean, the most obvious one is in Honduras in 2009, but also if you look at Brazil and the sort of institutional kind of the what happened to Dilma Rousseff and the whole corruption scandal there that was used to take her out, and then Lula being locked up and not being allowed to run, and that's why Bolsonaro wins. And of course, in 2012 in Paraguay, you had the sort of constitutional coup against Lugo, who had broken 70 years of one-party rule there. Bolivia in 2019. So the even what happened in Ecuador is kind of very sort of against Correa was very kind of dubious. Yeah, you have a sort of return to the more socialistic Latin American integrationist kind of policies. Now, are those, I think there's differences within the different governments, and I'm certainly not knowledgeable enough to know the internal dynamics in all of the different countries that well, but it is a sort of social democratic shift, but it's something that the Trudeau government has opposed. And why has the Trudeau government opposed it? Trudeau government has opposed it because they follow Washington, but also because Canadian mining companies have benefited from the neoliberal policies in the hemisphere over the past 25 years, because Canadian banks have also, to not quite the extent of the mining companies, but Canadian banks have really grown in Chile, in Colombia, in Peru, and the sort of socialistic direction is a threat. Also, the summit that was held in, I believe, in September in Mexico, where Maduro was invited. It was the CELAC summit, the Community of Latin American Caribbean States, which is sort of set up with the intent of replacing the Organization of American States, which is a very, based in Washington and is very pro-North American group. Canada's not part of CELAC, right? There's two countries that are not part of it. It's the US and Canada, right? It's really the hemisphere breaking away from the traditional North American dominance. And there's Canada's, obviously it's primarily Washington, but Canada has been right at the center of that. And the Lima Group is no better example than that. And that has collapsed. The Lima Group hasn't met, right? The CELAC met and they invited Maduro, and the Lima Group now is, it's not officially done, but in practice, I don't think it's met for like a year and a half. And so this definitely we can look at what's happened in Latin America and what's happened to Trudeau's policy in the hemisphere as a ray of light in a global politics that's often very grim. Any other questions, comments? If not, then we're getting pretty close to 7 o'clock, and I was try to keep it to an hour. Last chance. Oh, Laura, you got another? Go for it.
Sorry. I'm just wondering, I must get the impression that there's even less of an opening in the Canadian media than there is in the US, for example, to have a very alternative perspective on the Ukraine war. Or, do you think I'm wrong? I know you're probably not comparing media in both countries, but I sometimes get the impression when I'm home that in Canada that there's even less room for dissent on these policies.
Well, I think Ukraine is kind of unique. I did I mentioned that about Heather McPherson in Edmonton and the Ukrainian Studies program at the University of Alberta. Ukrainian nationalism, there's a significant amount of Ukrainian nationalism is a Canadian ideological formation. Right, Ukrainians that emigrated, particularly in the post World War II, people who had often allied with the Nazis, and them, in that case, setting up a university studies program at U of A, prominent authors that writing Ukrainian nationalist histories that are Canadian based. So there is a particularly Canada's climate on this question is particularly kind of anti-Russia, and the U.S. also has dynamics where the whole RussiaGate stuff in the U.S. has led to some sort of politicians and media that are aligned, that are sort of Republican aligned media, like I think probably clearest example maybe Tucker Carlson on Fox News, that they're sort of more open to they're trying to push back against this sort of Russia the devil, Russia the demon kind of drum beats, and so they offer some space for sort of more critical voices on what's going on in Ukraine. So I think that I think that as a general rule, the mythology in this country on foreign policy is so overwhelming of Canada being this viewed as sort of a benevolent international actor, but it's like it's completely laughable, right? If you look at any of the history, Canada has allied with the two major empires of the past 2 centuries and has been the uniquely close ally of the British and American Empire as they have instigated violence all around the world. And if you look at someone like like Rick Salutin, who's maybe a friend actually, maybe the most left-wing voice in the corporate media in this country, a column in the Globe for a long time, and then Toronto Star. If you look at how he kind of, I think, survives in part is by focusing on the U.S. Right, so he'll kind of weave Canada in a bit, but he kind of focuses on bad U.S. foreign policy. Yeah, and it's that's more acceptable to you're sort of allowed to criticize the U.S. It's a little bit one step removed. So yeah, I think that the media environment in this country is the narrowness of what's allowed to be said on Canadian foreign policy is remarkable, and that goes in the liberal domain, that goes on the CBC, and so yeah, it's a question that we need to be conscious of, and that's why we need to build up alternative media outlets like Canadian Dimension, like Rabble, like Spring Magazine. That's why we need to have alternative forums like the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute and this type of forum where there's ability to have a critical discussion of Canadian foreign policy. And of course, it's why we need to do our organizing and mobilization more generally to, force the dominant media and force the politicians to go in a different direction. But it's 7 o'clock, so I suggest that we leave it there. And if people have any questions, comments, send me an email. If people have suggestions for speakers or for themes for next week or future Canadian Foreign Policy Hours, please do send me that. And also, for future discussions, also action alerts and what campaigns are to share during the discussion. And I thank everyone for coming out, and have a good night.
Right.